How does a backpack end up 80 feet high in a tree? In 2024, arborists in Sequoia found one lodged in the canopy. Inside was a 10-year-old girl's journal with entries dated 3 days after she vanished. But here's what made investigators stop cold. The tree was far too massive to climb without ropes, yet the father's phone, recovered from that same backpack, had photos taken from 80 feet up, showing the forest below. The Harper family disappeared in Sequoia National Park on June 3, 2014. Robert Harper, 38, his wife Michelle, 36, their daughter Sophia, 10. They were on day 3 of a 7-day backpacking trip through the giant forest area. When they failed to check in at their scheduled waypoint, rangers began searching on June 7th. The initial search found their last campsite quickly. It was near the base of a massive sequoia known locally as the Sentinel Tree. The site showed signs of a hasty departure. One tent was half collapsed. Cooking gear was scattered. Michelle's jacket was draped over a log, but the family was gone. What made the scene unusual was the silence from their emergency beacon. The Harpers had rented a satellite communicator specifically for this trip. Robert had texted updates to his brother every evening. The last message came on June 2nd. Amazing day. Sophia climbed her first big tree with help. Weather perfect. All good here. Then, nothing. The search expanded rapidly. Sequoia's terrain is challenging in its own way. The giant trees create a canopy so dense that GPS signals become unreliable. The forest floor is littered with decades of fallen timber. Visibility drops to just a few yards in some areas. You can be 10 feet from someone and never see them. Search dogs track the family's scent east from the campsite toward a drainage area that led to higher elevations. But after half a mile, the trail simply ended. Not faded, not confused, just stopped, as if the family had been lifted off the ground. The lead investigator, a ranger named Thomas Blake, found that detail disturbing. He'd worked search and rescue in Sequoia for 16 years. He knew how scent trails behaved. They dispersed, they weakened, they got confused by water or weather, but they didn't just stop unless something interrupted them. What could interrupt a scent trail that abruptly? He asked the dog handler. The handler, a woman named Rita Chen, shook her head. In theory, fast-moving water, but there's no water here. Or if they got into a vehicle, but there's no road within 5 miles. Or ... She hesitated. Or what? Or if they went up instead of forward. Thomas looked at the massive sequoias surrounding them. Some were over 200 feet tall. Their lowest branches started 60 feet off the ground. You're saying they climbed? I'm saying the scent goes up, not out. My dogs keep looking up. They're trained to track ground scent. When they lose this completely, it usually means vertical displacement. But why would an entire family climb a giant sequoia? And more importantly, how? These weren't normal trees. Their bark was thick and rough, yes, but the trunks were so wide that wrapping your arms around them was impossible. The first branches were unreachable without serious climbing equipment. The Harpers had basic gear, rope for hanging food bags, carabiners for securing pack, but nothing that would facilitate a climb of that magnitude. Days turned into weeks. The search area expanded to cover over 60 square miles. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew grid patterns. Volunteers checked every trail, every campsite, every fishing spot. They found nothing. By June 21st, the official search was suspended. The Harpers were classified as missing person. The case was filed away with dozens of other unsolved disappearances in America's national park. Robert's brother, James Harper, refused to accept it. He spent his savings hiring private search teams. He lobbied park officials for continued searches. He created a website documenting every detail of the case. But 10 years passed with no answers. Then, in April of 2024, a tree service company was hired to assess the health of several giant sequoias near the Sentinel Tree. The Park Service had concerns about root damage from years of drought. Arborists needed to inspect the upper canopy, areas that hadn't been visually examined in decades. Kyle Morrison was 70 feet up the Sentinel Tree when he saw it, a dark shape wedged in the fork of a massive branch. At first, he thought it was a bird's nest or accumulated debris, but as he got closer, his stomach dropped. It was a backpack, faded blue fabric, partially torn, straps tangled in smaller branches, and it was far too intact to have been up there for long, except, as Kyle would later tell investigators, it had clearly been there for years. The fabric showed UV damage. Moss was growing on one side. This wasn't recent. Kyle radioed his supervisor. Within hours, the Park Service was on site. A technical rescue team was assembled to safely retrieve the backpack. By late afternoon, it was on the ground. The name tag inside read Sophia Harper. Thomas Blake was retired by then, living in Oregon, but when he got the call, he was on a plane the next morning. He needed to see this himself. The backpack was taken to a forensic lab in Fresno. Every item was cataloged: a water bottle, empty, a granola bar wrapper, a small stuffed elephant, well worn, a journal with a purple cover, and a phone in a waterproof case. The journal was what made Thomas's hands shake as he read it. The first entries were typical 10-year-old observations. "We saw a deer today. It had spot. Mom said it was a baby. I named him Pepper." Drawings of trees and flowers filled the margins. Then the entry shifted. June 3rd. "Dad says we have to climb. Something is wrong with Mom. She keeps saying things that don't make sense. She wanted to walk into the woods without her backpack. Dad won't let her. He says we need to go up where it's safe." June 4th. "We're in the tree now. It's really high. I'm scared, but Dad says this is the only way. Mom is sleeping a lot. Dad gave me his phone to hold. He says if something happens to him, I should try to signal for help from up here." June 5th. "Mom woke up, but she doesn't know where we are. She tried to climb down, but Dad stopped her. We ate the last of our food. Dad says someone will see us soon. I hope he's right. My elephant is helping me be brave." June 6th. "Dad isn't moving anymore. I tried to wake him, but he won't wake up. Mom is—" The entry ended there. The rest of the page was blank. Thomas read it 3 times. Each time the implications became more disturbing. Something had happened to Michelle. Something that made Robert feel they needed to climb a giant sequoia for safety. But safety from what? The phone provided more answers, but they only deepened the mystery. Robert's photo gallery showed the progression. Early photos from the trip were cheerful. The family at the trailhead, Sophia posing with a walking stick, Michelle laughing beside a stream. Then, on June 2nd, the photos changed. There was a series of images taken at their campsite. Michelle sitting by the fire, but her expression was vacant, staring at nothing. Another photo showed her standing at the edge of camp, her back to the camera, facing into the dark forest. The timestamp on that photo was 2:30 in the morning. The next photos were taken from high in a tree. The perspective was dizzying. You could see the forest floor far below. One image showed Sophia's face, tear-streaked, looking at the camera. Another showed rope tied around a branch. A third showed Michelle, secured with rope, unconscious or sleeping. They were heading northeast, toward Thoroughfare Ridge. Rob was in front, moving with the confidence of someone who'd walked that path 100 times. Tyler was a few steps behind, adjusting his pack. Daniel was boiling water for coffee when they passed. He raised a hand, a simple wave, the universal language of hunters who respect each other's space. Rob nodded back. Tyler smiled. And then they disappeared into the tree line. Daniel thought about that wave for 9 years. He thought about it when the news broke, when search teams flooded the area, when the case went cold. He'd given his statement to the authorities, told them everything he knew, the direction they were headed, the time, the fact that they looked prepared, calm, normal. He'd done everything right, but it didn't stop the questions, the guilt, the nagging feeling that maybe, if he'd paid more attention, if he'd said something, if he'd offered to join them, things would have been different. He stopped hunting for a while after that, couldn't bring himself to go back. Daniel's life changed after October 2015, not in obvious ways. He still went to work, still paid his bills, still showed up when friends invited him to dinner, but something inside him had shifted. A weight had settled in his chest that he couldn't shake. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that wave, that smile, the casual nod Rob had given him before disappearing into the trees. He'd replayed that morning 1,000 times, analyzed every detail, the direction they'd walked, the way Rob had checked his compass, compass, the color of Tyler's jacket, blue, bright blue, the kind you could spot from half a mile away. How had no one found that jacket? How had two grown men, one of them an experienced ranger, just vanished? The logical part of Daniel's brain knew it wasn't his fault. He'd done nothing wrong. He'd given his statement, cooperated fully, told the investigators everything he knew. But logic doesn't quiet guilt, and guilt doesn't follow rules. In the first year, he avoided the mountains entirely, sold his hunting rifle, canceled his permit. His friends noticed, asked if he was okay. He told them he was busy with work, needed a break. They didn't push. People rarely do. In year 2, he tried to go back, drove to a different forest, somewhere with no memories, set up camp, spent the night staring at his tent ceiling, listening to the wind. At dawn, he packed up and went home. He wasn't ready. Year 3 was worse. That's when the dreams started. He'd dream he was back at that campsite, boiling water for coffee. He'd see Rob and Tyler walking past. He'd wave, but in the dream, they'd stop, turn around, ask him to come with them, and he'd say no. Every time, he'd say no, and then he'd watch them disappear. He'd wake up sweating, heart pounding, with the overwhelming certainty that if he'd just said yes, everything would be different. He started reading about the case obsessively. Every article, every forum post, every amateur theory. Some people thought they'd been attacked by a bear, but there was no evidence, no blood, no torn clothing. Others thought they'd fallen into a river, but the nearest river was 5 miles away, and the dogs would have found a trail. A few people, the conspiracy theorists, thought something stranger. Government cover-up, alien abduction, dimensional portal. Daniel dismissed those immediately, but even the rational theories didn't add up. By year 4, he'd joined an online community of people obsessed with missing persons cases. He didn't post much, mostly just read, learned about search patterns, survival statistics, how long a person can last without food, without water, without shelter. He learned that the human body, in cold conditions, can shut down within hours, that hypothermia steals your judgment before it steals your life, that people sometimes take off their clothes in the final stages, a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, because their overheating brain tricks them into thinking they're burning up. He learned that most people who go missing in the wilderness are found within the first 72 hours. After that, the odds drop exponentially. After 2 weeks, they're almost zero. Rob and Tyler had been missing for 9 years. Year 5 was the turning point. Daniel's therapist, a patient woman named Dr. Reeves, who'd been listening to his guilt for 3 years, finally asked him a question that changed everything. She asked him what he'd do if he could go back, if he could relive that morning. Would he follow them? Daniel said yes without hesitation. Of course he would. He'd follow them, keep them in sight, be there if something went wrong. Dr. Reeves nodded. Then she asked him another question. If you'd followed them, and whatever happened to them happened to you too, would that be better? Daniel didn't have an answer. She explained that survivor's guilt isn't logical, that his brain was trying to create a scenario where he had control, where his presence would have made a difference. But the truth was, he didn't know what happened to them. And there was a very real possibility that if he'd been there, he'd be missing too. That his family would be the ones searching. His mother would be the one walking those trails every spring. His name would be the one on missing posters. It didn't make the guilt go away, but it made it smaller, manageable. By year 6, Daniel started hiking again. Short trails, day trips, nothing overnight. He brought his camera instead of a rifle, started taking pictures of the landscape, the way light filtered through trees, the patterns frost made on leaves. He posted them online. People said he had an eye for it, that his photos captured something real, something honest. Year 7, he returned to Wyoming, not to Bridger-Teton, not yet, but to the Wind River Range, 100 miles south. He camped for 3 days, didn't sleep much, but he stayed. And when he drove home, he felt something close to peace. Not closure, but acceptance. The understanding that some questions don't have answers, that some people disappear, and you never know why. Year 8, Catherine Harrison reached out to him. She'd found his email through the investigators' files. Her message was short, kind. She said she didn't blame him, that she wanted him to know that she knew he'd been carrying something heavy and she wanted him to put it down. She said Rob would have liked him, that he was the kind of person Rob respected. Someone who went into the wilderness alone, who knew how to be quiet, who understood what the silence meant. Daniel cried when he read that email, sat at his kitchen table and cried for the first time since October 2015. And then he wrote back, thanked her, told her he thought about them often, that he hoped somehow they'd found peace, that wherever they were together. Catherine replied that she hoped so too. Year 9, Daniel made the decision. He was going back to Bridger-Teton, back to the trails where he'd last seen them, not to hunt, not to search, just to be there, to walk the same path, to prove to himself that he could, that the forest didn't own him, that guilt, no matter how heavy, could be carried. But the mountains have a way of calling you. And in October 2024, 9 years later, Daniel returned to Bridger-Teton. He told himself it was closure, a way to put the memory to rest. He wasn't even planning to hunt, just wanted to walk the trails again, to prove to himself that he could. He set up camp in a different area this time, farther west, away from where he'd seen them, away from the ghosts. On the third day, he decided to track an elk, not to shoot, just to follow, to see where it led. The animal moved northeast, weaving through dense pines and across a meadow dotted with wildflowers. Daniel followed at a distance, his boots crunching softly on the carpet of fallen needles. And then the ground moved. Not an earthquake, not a collapse, just a slight give under his right foot, like stepping on a hollow log. He froze, took a step back. The earth looked solid, covered in pine needles, small shrubs, years of accumulated forest debris. But something about it felt wrong. He knelt down, brushed away the top layer of needles. Underneath was soil, loose, crumbly. He pushed aside more debris, following the strange texture. And then he saw it, a gap, just a few inches wide but deep. He cleared away more branches, more soil. The gap widened, and suddenly he was staring at a hole, a sinkhole, hidden under years of forest growth. The opening was maybe 4 feet across, partially covered by a rotting log and a tangle of dead branches. If you didn't know it was there, you'd walk right over it, or into it. Daniel's heart was pounding. He pulled out his flashlight, leaned over the edge, and shined the beam down. The hole dropped about 15 feet, opening into a small limestone chamber. The walls were smooth, carved by water over thousands of years. The floor was uneven, littered with rocks and dirt that had fallen in over time. And there, at the bottom, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A knife, a hunting knife with a worn leather grip, and next to it, another one. 2 knives lying side by side in the dirt. For a moment, Daniel couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He was staring down into that hole, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and every rational thought in his head was screaming at him to back away, to call for help, to let someone else handle this. But he couldn't, because he knew, with absolute certainty, what those knives meant. He sat back on his heels, flashlight still pointed into the chamber. His mind was racing. 2 knives, side by side, the kind of detail that meant something. Hunters don't just drop their knives, especially not experienced hunters like Rob. If the knives were there, if they were together, it meant they'd been placed there. Intentionally. It meant someone had survived the fall long enough to organize, to think, to leave evidence. Daniel's hands found his phone. No signal. Of course not. He was miles from any cell tower, deep in terrain that barely saw foot traffic. He'd have to go back to camp, call from there. But first, he needed to know. He needed to see. The rope was in his pack. 50 feet of climbing rope, barely used. He'd brought it out of habit, not expecting to need it. Now, as he tied it around the trunk of the nearest pine, testing the knot 3 times, he was grateful for that habit. The tree was solid, old growth, the kind of pine that had been standing for 100 years and would stand for 100 more. He tossed the other end of the rope into the hole. It uncoiled as it fell, hitting the bottom with a soft thud. Daniel pulled on his gloves, took a breath, and lowered himself over the edge. The descent was slower than he expected. The rope was rough against his palms, even through the gloves. His boots scraped against the limestone walls, searching for footholds that weren't there. The walls were smooth, worn by water over centuries. No wonder they hadn't been able to climb out. Halfway down, his flashlight caught something. A mark on the wall. Scratches. Deliberate. He angled the beam closer. They were tally marks. 4 vertical lines crossed by a 5th. Then another set. And another. Someone had been counting days. Daniel's throat tightened. He kept descending. His boots hit the ground with a dull thud. The chamber was smaller than it had looked from above, maybe 10 feet across. The ceiling was 15 feet up, the opening a circle of daylight that seemed impossibly far away. The air was cold, damp, the kind of cold that settles into your bones and doesn't leave. He could see his breath. The floor was uneven, covered in rocks, dirt, and debris that had fallen in over the years. And there, in the center, were the knives. He'd been right. They were placed carefully, intentionally. The blades were clean, the leather grips worn but intact. These were good knives, the kind you take care of, the kind that last a lifetime. Next to the knives was the emergency pouch, bright orange, sealed, exactly where it should be. Daniel picked it up. The material was waterproof, still intact after 9 years. He opened it slowly, hands trembling. Inside was the notebook, the flares, and the note. He read it by flashlight. Every word, every line. Rob's handwriting was steady at first, clear. But as the entries continued, as the days passed, the letters became shakier, smaller, the words more fragmented. Daniel could see the deterioration, could feel the hope draining from each sentence. October 25th. They'd fallen through just after dawn. Rob wrote that Tyler had been ahead of him, that the ground had given way under Tyler's feet first. Rob had lunged forward to grab him, and they'd both gone down. Tyler had landed hard on his shoulder. Rob's leg had twisted beneath him when he hit the bottom. They'd called for help, screamed until their throats were raw. No one answered. October 26th. Rob wrote that they'd tried to climb. Tyler had made it about 6 feet up before the rock crumbled. He'd fallen back down, landing on his injured shoulder. Rob had tried next, using his belt as a grip, but his leg couldn't support his weight. They decided to conserve energy, to wait. Someone would find their camp. Someone would come looking. October 27th. The entry was shorter. They'd heard a helicopter, distant. They'd set off one of the flares, but the opening was too narrow. The trees above blocked the signal. The helicopter had passed. They'd yelled, waved, used the second flare. Nothing. The sound faded. They were alone again. October 28th. Rob wrote about Tyler, said he was getting weaker, that his shoulder was swelling, that he'd stopped shivering, which Rob knew was a bad sign. He'd given Tyler his jacket, tried to keep him warm, told him stories about when he was a kid, about the first time they'd gone camping together. Tyler had been 6, scared of the dark. Rob had sat up with him all night, teaching him the constellations. October 29th, the final entry, just a few lines. Rob wrote that Tyler wasn't responding anymore, that he was trying to keep him awake but couldn't, that he was sorry, that he'd failed, that if anyone found this, please tell Catherine and Emma that they'd been brave, that they'd tried, that they'd loved them. And then the writing stopped. Daniel stood there holding that notebook and felt something break inside him. This was it. This was the answer everyone had been searching for. 9 years of questions, of theories, of desperate hope, and it all came down to this: a hidden sinkhole, a father trying to save his son, a tragedy that no one could have prevented because no one knew the danger existed. He looked around the chamber again, saw the tally marks on the wall. 13 of them, 13 days. But Rob's last entry was October 29th, 4 days after they fell, which meant Rob had survived another 9 days after Tyler. Alone, in the dark, counting days on the wall because there was nothing else to do. Daniel's flashlight swept across the chamber one more time, and that's when he saw them. The stones, 2 of them, smooth, round, placed together in the alcove. He knelt down, picked one up. It was cold, heavy, the kind of stone you'd find in a riverbed, polished by water over years. He didn't know what they meant. Maybe nothing. Maybe Rob had picked them up to pass the time, to have something to hold, or maybe they meant something more, something private, a promise, a memory, a way to keep Tyler close even after he was gone. Daniel put the stone back carefully, exactly where he'd found it. Some things weren't meant to be moved. Daniel's hands were shaking as he called out. His voice echoed in the chamber. No response. He called again. Nothing. He knew, even before he climbed down, what he was going to find. But he had to see it. He had to know. He rigged a rope to a nearby tree, tested it twice, and lowered himself into the hole. The air inside was damp and cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. His boots hit the ground with a dull thud. He swept the flashlight across the chamber, and there, tucked into a small alcove on the far side, was a waterproof emergency pouch. It was the kind of pouch every experienced hunter carries, bright orange, sealed tight. Daniel picked it up with trembling hands and opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a small notebook, and 2 emergency flares. Unused. He unfolded the paper. The handwriting was neat, steady, written by someone who knew they were running out of time but refused to panic. It was Rob's handwriting. The note was dated October 25th, 2015, the same day Daniel had waved to them, the same morning they'd headed toward Thoroughfare Ridge. The note was simple, direct, the words of a man trying to save his son. It said they'd fallen through the ground around mid-morning, that the opening had been covered, camouflaged by branches and debris, that Rob had gone through first and Tyler had tried to grab him. They'd both gone down. Rob had injured his leg in the fall. Tyler had hurt his shoulder. They'd tried to climb out, but the walls were too smooth, too high. They'd called for help until their voices gave out. No one came. Rob wrote that they'd tried to use the flares, but the opening was too narrow. The signal wouldn't reach above the canopy. They'd tried to stack rocks, to build something to climb. But the rocks were loose. The dirt crumbled, and Rob's leg was getting worse. The note ended with a message to Catherine and Emma. telling them he loved them, that Tyler had been brave, that they'd done everything they could. And then, in the final line, Rob had written something that made Daniel's chest tighten. He wrote that if anyone found this, they should know that they hadn't suffered, that they'd told stories, that they'd kept each other warm, that in the end, it was quiet. Daniel stood in that chamber for a long time, the flashlight beam steady on the note. He thought about the wave, about the smile Tyler had given him, about the fact that he'd been less than a mile away when they'd fallen, that if he'd followed them, if he'd just decided to walk the same trail, if he'd heard them calling, but he hadn't, and they'd been here, 15 feet below the surface, hidden in a sinkhole that didn't exist on any map, waiting for someone to find them. Daniel climbed out of the hole and called the authorities. The response was immediate. Within hours, search and rescue teams, forensic experts, and investigators descended on the site. They cordoned off the area, carefully excavated the sinkhole, retrieved what remained of Rob and Tyler Harrison. The official report confirmed what Rob had written. They'd fallen through a concealed sinkhole opening. The structure was a natural limestone formation created by underground water erosion. Over time, the entrance had been covered by fallen trees, branches, and forest debris. It was invisible from above, a trap waiting in the wilderness. Rob's leg had been fractured in the fall. Tyler's shoulder was dislocated, but the injuries, while painful, weren't fatal. What killed them was exposure. The chamber was cold, damp, without sunlight, without a way to signal for help. They'd lasted several days, based on the notes Rob had continued to write in the small notebook. Each entry shorter than the last, each one a little less hopeful. The final entry was dated October 29th, 4 days after they'd fallen. Rob wrote that Tyler had stopped shivering, that he was trying to keep him awake, that he was sorry. And then the writing stopped. Catherine and Emma were notified the same day. Catherine, who had walked those trails every spring for 9 years, finally had an answer. Emma, who had kept her brother's face on every social media platform, finally had closure. It wasn't the answer they wanted, but it was an answer. The sinkhole was filled in after the recovery, marked with a small memorial plaque, a warning to other hunters, a reminder that the wilderness, no matter how beautiful, is unforgiving. Daniel attended the memorial service. He didn't know if he should, didn't know if the family would want to see him. But Catherine found him in the crowd. She took his hands in hers and thanked him, told him that because of him they could finally say goodbye, that Rob and Tyler weren't lost anymore. They were home. But Daniel still thinks about that wave, about the smile, about the fact that he was the last person to see them before they disappeared, and he wonders, late at night when sleep won't come, if things would have been different if he'd just followed them, if he'd walked the same trail, if he'd been there when the ground gave way. The truth is, he'll never know. None of us will. What we do know is that Rob and Tyler Harrison didn't vanish into thin air. They didn't get lost. They didn't make a mistake. They fell through a hidden crack in the earth, and the forest closed over them like a secret. And for 9 years they waited in the dark, until the ground gave way again, until Daniel's boot found the hollow, until the forest finally let them go. Some mysteries don't have villains. Some tragedies don't have someone to blame. Sometimes the wilderness is just the wilderness, beautiful and brutal in equal measure, and sometimes the only thing separating a father-son hunting trip from a 9-year disappearance is a patch of ground that looks solid but isn't. a hole that doesn't exist on any map, a trap that no one saw coming. Rob had written in his final notes that he hoped someone would find them, that someone would tell their story, that Catherine and Emma would know they'd fought, that they'd tried, that they hadn't given up. Daniel made sure that story was told. He spoke to reporters. He walked investigators through every detail. He made sure the world knew that Rob and Tyler Harrison didn't just disappear. They fell, they fought, they waited, and in the end, they were found. But there's one part of the story that Daniel keeps to himself, one detail that didn't make it into any official report. When he climbed down into that sinkhole, when he found the emergency pouch, he also found something else. 2 small stones placed side by side near the knives. Smooth, round, the kind you'd skip across a lake, the kind a father might give to a son, the kind that might have been a promise, a reminder, a way to say, "We're in this together." Daniel left those stones where he found them. He didn't mention them to the investigators, didn't include them in his statement, because some things are meant to stay in the forest. Some things are private, sacred. A final moment between a father and son that the rest of the world doesn't need to see. And when the sinkhole was filled in, when the earth was smoothed over and the memorial plaque was placed, Daniel knew those stones were still there, 15 feet down, hidden again, together. Rob and Tyler's story didn't end the way anyone hoped, but it ended with an answer, with closure, with a memorial service where friends and family could finally say goodbye. And it ended because a hunter who'd carried guilt for 9 years decided to come back, to face the mountains, to track an elk that led him to a patch of ground that gave way under his boot. Some people say it was fate, that Daniel was meant to find them, that the forest had been waiting for him to return. Others say it was just chance, a coincidence, the random intersection of time and place. But Catherine Harrison doesn't care which it is. She just knows that her husband and son aren't lost anymore, that they're at peace, that their story, as heartbreaking as it is, finally has an ending. And maybe that's enough. Maybe, in the face of wilderness and silence and all the ways the world can swallow people whole, finding an ending is all we can ask for. Even if it takes 9 years, even if it's hidden 15 feet underground, even if the person who finds it is a stranger who once waved goodbye and never forgot. Daniel still hunts. He still walks those trails. But now, when he passes that filled-in sinkhole, when he sees the memorial plaque with Rob and Tyler's names, he stops. He stands there for a moment, and he says the words he wishes he'd said 9 years ago. Not goodbye, not sorry, just a simple acknowledgement, a hunter's nod, the universal language of respect. And then he keeps walking, because that's what you do in the wilderness. You keep moving, you keep searching, you keep hoping that if you ever fall through a crack in the earth, someone will come looking, someone will find you, someone will tell your story, and maybe, just maybe, that's what makes us human. Not the fact that we can survive the wilderness, but the fact that we go back for each other. Even when it takes 9 years, even when the ground looks solid but isn't, even when the answer is buried so deep that it takes a miracle to find it. Rob and Tyler Harrison went hunting in October 2015. They never came home, but 9 years later, thanks to a hunter who couldn't forget a wave, they were finally found. And their story, as tragic as it is, reminds us that even in the darkest places, even in the silence of a hidden chamber 15 feet underground, we're never truly alone. Someone is always looking, someone always remembers, and sometimes against all odds, someone finds us. What do you think? Could you imagine being in that situation, trapped with no way out, no way to signal for help? Could you imagine being Daniel, carrying that memory for 9 years, only to be the one who finds them? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to support more stories like this. Thank you so much for watching. I love you all. Until next time.